What if the most important words are spoken in a whisper when no one is listening? Tonight, we will listen in on the quiet conversations that change the fate of the North, to the words that were sharper than a sword, and the silent vows made in the shade of a godswood. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, get comfortable. Imagine an icy wind howling outside your window as you sit by the fire, ready to hear a story. Can an ordinary dinner change the fate of the entire world? It sounds like the premise of an epic saga, filled with the thunder of battles and the cries of warriors. But sometimes, significant, fate-altering moments don't happen on blood-soaked battlefields or in opulent royal halls. Instead, they occur in a quiet corner, in the dim light, where just two people share a simple meal and profound thoughts. These are the invisible threads that weave the tapestry of history. Today, we journey into the heart of the harsh North, to the ancient walls of Castle Black, a place where cold and solitude hold as many threats as ancient legends. It was here, in this forgotten but strategically vital location, that one of the most incredible and touching friendships was born, destined to become not just a support, but a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness threatening to engulf the continent. We're talking about Jon Snow, the bastard of the North and a brother of the Night's Watch, and Samwell Tarly, the timid son of a lord, exiled by his father, but who became a valuable scholar and keeper of knowledge. Two different souls, two paths that should never have crossed, yet fate brought them together at the edge of the world, on the frontier meant to protect humanity from a forgotten but awakening evil. Imagine this scene unfolding before your eyes. Beyond the castle, an impenetrable night reigns. Icy wind whistles through every crack in the ancient frozen stones, making the towers moan and howl like wounded beasts. Biting frost penetrates every fissure, leaving a thin crust of ice on the walls and creeping beneath any thick clothing, promising eternal frigidity. The air carries not just cold, but a premonition of something inevitable, something heavy, waiting its hour beyond the Great Wall. Beyond this icy barrier, the colossal guardian of the world. But inside one of the rooms, a small space that Samwell, thanks to his resourcefulness, had managed to turn into a semblance of a refuge from the frost. It was now warm. A small but fierce hearth, built of rough stones, cast orange reflections on the rugged walls, making shadows dance in whimsical patterns. The damp air, typical of this old castle, had given way to a dry, crackling warmth. At a simple, well-worn wooden table, one that remembered the first Lord Commanders of the Watch, sat John and Sam. No luxurious dishes, no exquisite wines or spices, just two clay bowls of hot steaming stew, a thick mixture of barley, dried vegetables, and cured meat, and of course, a piece of stale bread that needed soaking. This was no feast, no holiday dinner, no ceremonial reception, just simple sustenance, necessary for maintaining strength in this harsh land where every day was a struggle for survival. In Castle Black, where every resource was accounted for, this food was almost a luxury, warming both body and soul. The dense, heavy silence, in which one could almost hear their own heartbeat, was broken only by the rhythmic clinking of tin spoons against rough clay bowls. Occasionally, there was the quiet, lulling crackle of wood in the hearth, as if old, dried timber whispered its centuries-old secrets, or a soft whistle of wind seeping through a small, tarred parchment-covered window, which served as the only source of external light. The entire atmosphere of the room was filled with unspoken thoughts, a deep, shared understanding, and that wonderful comfort that only true, profound friendship, forged in shared trials and hardships, can provide. Sam, as always, was engrossed in an old, tattered book that he, with incredible diligence and an almost maniacal passion, had unearthed in the dusty, years-forgotten library of Castle Black. It was a true treasure trove for him. Ancient chronicles, manuscripts, scrolls, many of which seemed untouched since the long night. He carefully, almost reverently, turned the yellowed pages, his plump fingers gliding over ancient symbols, as if trying to absorb every word, every letter, every forgotten fact. From time to time, he would look up, glancing at John, who seemed to be simply eating, staring into space. But in reality, his gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the walls, into the cold darkness from which he had recently returned, where he had seen what no one else alive had witnessed. John was deep in thought, remembering what he had seen, what he had learned, what had almost cost him his life and changed him forever. Finally, Sam, unable to contain his excitement from a new discovery he had made in yet another ancient tome, spoke quietly. His voice was soft, almost uncertain, as always, but it always carried a deep note of sincere, genuine fascination, capable of igniting the flame of interest, even in the most pragmatic listener. John, you have to hear this. It talks about how the wall was actually built, not just by some magic, as many think, or merely by the labor of thousands of workers and slaves. It says here that the wall was imbued with magic not only from ice collected over centuries, but also blood. They say every 100 feet of the wall cost someone's life. Not metaphorically, but literally. Hundreds of thousands of people, brave warriors, unfortunate criminals, simple builders, they gave their lives so that this barrier, this ice shield, this colossal monument to human resilience would stand for centuries, protecting the world from the unknown. Imagine, John, how many generations of watchmen, common folk, volunteers, and criminals gave their lives so we could sit here relatively peacefully, so humanity could sleep soundly, forgetting the horrors of the past. John nodded, tearing his gaze from his bowl, his eyes, gray and deep, reflecting the light of the hearth. In them was not only weariness, but knowledge, dearly bought. I know that, Sam. We literally live on the bones of those who came before us. This land is soaked with their sweat, their blood, their sacrifices. Every stone of the wall seems to whisper of long past eras and unspeakable horrors. But to know something with your mind, to see it in old books, and to feel it with your entire being, having experienced it yourself, those are completely different things, especially when you've seen what lies beyond that barrier yourself, and that it's ready to awaken. He looked up at his friend, and in his gaze was deep weariness, but also an unwavering resolve, tempered by battle. What else is written there, Sam? About those who lived beyond the wall before it became home to the wildlings. About ancient peoples everyone has forgotten. About what people chose not to remember so as not to confront the fear. And then, in this small, warm room, in the heart of Westeros's grim castle, their conversation began. A conversation that seemed like mere friendly chatter, an exchange of knowledge and impressions. But in reality, it wove invisible, strong threads of past, present, and future. This was not just a talk, but a kind of collective investigation, a search for answers to questions no one else dared to ask. Samwell, with his erudition, which he had accumulated over years, studying every book, every scroll that came into his hands in the libraries, spoke of ancient kings and queens whose names had long faded from most people's memory. He spoke of times when magic was alive, when the world was filled not only with wonders, but also with horrors, which now were only whispered about around campfires, dismissed as children's tales. He recounted the first men, their mysterious rituals, their connection to nature, their primal gods. He described the children of the forest, an ancient, almost mythical people whose roots went deep into this land, their strange, melodic songs that could alter the world, and even stranger, but powerful abilities. He spoke of great battles, heroic deeds, and betrayals that shaped this world and brought it to its current state, an era of decline and oblivion. His voice grew more confident as he delved into his favorite subject. His eyes lit up with the fire of knowledge, and his cheeks flushed with excitement. He quoted old chronicles, pondered legends, compared various sources, trying to find the grain of truth in centuries of myth, refuting common misconceptions. For Sam, books were not merely dry texts, not just collections of dusty pages, but living testimonies of long past eras, keys to understanding the present, and most importantly, to foreseeing the future. John listened intently, without interrupting, as if absorbing every word. He was a man of action, a warrior who relied on his sword, his own strength, and common sense, not on words and ancient knowledge. But he understood that knowledge was also power, and sometimes far more potent than any steel or army. Especially knowledge of the past, of forgotten threats that now loomed on the horizon again. His own experience beyond the wall, his encounters with wildlings who told terrifying tales, his horrifying clashes with the White Walkers, all of this made him look at ancient stories differently. What for most people in Westeros were merely children's bedtime stories, foolish legends told to scare disobedient children by the fireplace, for him became a chilling, horrifying reality. He had seen them with his own eyes, their glowing blue eyes and icy blades. He had felt their cold, which not only froze the flesh, but penetrated the very soul. "Sam," John said, his voice deeper and more serious than usual, a whisper filled with unspeakable gravity. "Those stories about the long night, about the White Walkers, they're true. I've seen them. I've seen the dead walk, their lifeless, empty faces, their eternal army. I've seen them turn the living into their own kind, with the touch of their cold. I've seen their icy blades, capable of cutting steel, and eyes full of ancient, merciless hatred for all living things. They're coming back, Sam. They are already here, beyond our wall, and they are coming." Sam nodded, his plump face serious and focused. He was one of the few who believed John unconditionally, because he himself had seen the evidence. He himself had read about them in old books that had gathered dust in the library for decades, as if awaiting his arrival. He knew that fear, pride, overconfidence, and ignorance had made people forget the true threat that the wall was meant to protect them from, turning it from a vital barrier into a symbol of exile. "I know, John. The most ancient texts say they come with the cold, bringing endless night and darkness, and that only fire, dragon glass, and perhaps dragon steel can stop them, and that they awaken when the world forgets them, when people become too complacent, too engrossed in their petty squabbles, wars for the Iron Throne, and personal ambitions. It's like an ancient disease, waiting for its hour until humanity's immunity weakens. until it becomes an easy prey. Their conversation, barely audible in that cold room, quickly shifted from historical facts and ancient prophecies to the impending, inevitable threat already knocking at the gates of their world. John recounted what he had seen with his own eyes: the reanimating dead, the chilling terror permeating the entire north, how the wildlings, despite their wildness, enmity, and savagery, were fleeing this threat in panic, preferring to die at the hands of the Night's Watch brothers than face the others. He spoke of how difficult it was to convince others, those sitting in warm castles in the south, engrossed in their intrigues and power struggles, that ancient monsters were real and posed a threat to all humanity. "They laugh in my face, Sam," John said, clenching his fists in helplessness and anger. "They call me mad, a savage, a liar, anything but acknowledging the obvious. It's easier for them to think these are just legends, wildling fabrications, than to face a truth that demands sacrifice and unity." Sam, in turn, shared what he had read about ancient prophecies, about past heroes who once saved the world from darkness, about the omens that were supposed to precede the others' return, and about what needed to be done to stop them. They both felt an impossible burden falling on their still young but already burdened shoulders, for they were among the few who understood the true scale of the impending catastrophe. The rest simply didn't believe, preferring to ignore the obvious, or, worse, seeing it as a threat to their own ambitions and power, rather than to all humanity. Their friendship was extraordinary, forged in the harsh reality, in the fire of trials, and on the brink of death. John, a born swordsman and courageous warrior, strong, silent, sharp, but always true to his duty, possessing natural leadership and an iron will. Sam, a scholar and thinker, timid, clumsy, but with a sharp mind, phenomenal memory, and an inexhaustible thirst for knowledge, capable of seeing connections where others saw only chaos. But it was their differences, their opposites, their seeming incompatibility that made them so strong together, so unbeatable in their shared, vital purpose. John gave Sam the courage he so lacked, self-confidence, and the ability to act when the situation demanded it. Sam gave John the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of ancient threats that John, as a man of action, could never have fully acquired on his own, and without which all his bravery would have been in vain. They were two halves of a whole, two pillars necessary for the survival of humanity in the face of impending darkness. In this cold, yet cozy room, at this simple table, their bond strengthened with every passing minute, becoming an unbreakable, unyielding foundation for all the future trials that awaited them. The moments of silence that arose between their words were as important as the words themselves. They contained deep understanding, genuine empathy, a shared burden that they carried together, without any external support or comprehension. Little needed to be said to understand each other. The mere presence of a friend, their silent approval or concern, was the only comfort in this world, full of dangers, loneliness, and distrust. The clinking of cutlery ceased. The plates were empty, but a sense of fullness, not only of the stomach, but of the soul, remained. Only the steady crackle of the hearth reminded them of warmth, of life still flickering in this gloomy, ancient castle, standing guard over the world. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside, thanks to the warmth of the fire and the warmth of friendship, there was a temporary calm, necessary for a respite before the storm. "We have to convince them, Sam," John said, his voice a whisper filled with despair, and an iron resolve that could move mountains. "All of them, the lords, the kings, the queens, everyone who sits in their warm castles and plays their deadly games, the whole world, if necessary. Otherwise, everything we fight for, everything our ancestors died for, will be meaningless. Everything will perish under the eternal night. We'll try, John, Sam replied, his gaze full of newfound determination that once seemed beyond him. His plump fingers clutched the ancient book as if it were a shield. We must. We are among the few who know the truth, who have seen it, and we cannot back down until we have exhausted every possibility. Otherwise, nothing will remain but ice and death, and the memory of humanity will be erased. This quiet conversation in Castle Black was more than just a dinner. It was an unspoken oath, an unbreakable vow made between two souls whose destinies became intertwined. An oath of friendship, stronger than any blood or title. An oath of knowledge, which was a weapon against ignorance. An oath to fight for the survival of all humanity. This was the moment when two souls merged into a single, all-consuming purpose, carrying on their still young, but already burdened shoulders, the weight of future events, the premonition of which hung in the air like a frosty mist. John and Sam's dinner was just a tiny, almost imperceptible moment in the scope of Westeros's history. But it is precisely such moments, filled with sincerity, trust, and a shared, all-consuming purpose, that sometimes change the course of events more than any great armies, the loudest battles, or opulent coronations. They were sparks that sooner or later were bound to ignite the flame of a great struggle, a struggle for life, for the future. And their friendship, forged in cold and fear, under the pressure of an unprecedented threat, became one of the most touching, most important, and truest bonds in the history of this world, proving that true strength is not always in the sword, but often in words and in understanding. Sometimes, to change the North, to save the world from encroaching darkness, what's needed is not a great battle, not a magical spell, not crowds of supporters, but merely a quiet conversation between two friends over a simple dinner, where the sounds of spoons and the crackle of fire become the only accompaniment to the most fateful decisions that could ever be made. This is a story of hope, of loyalty, of courage, of how even in the darkest, coldest corners of the world, human warmth, genuine friendship, and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge can become the most powerful, most effective weapon against any looming darkness. And so, John and Sam, two guardians, two friends, two people upon whose shoulders rested an impossible burden, continued their service, knowing that their quiet conversations, their shared nights full of exchanging knowledge and experience, would one day echo throughout the North, and perhaps all of Westeros, awakening people to the true threat and calling them to unity in the face of a common enemy. Their dinner was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but it laid the foundation for everything that was to follow. If you found this tale of unlikely heroism inspiring, please give this video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the stories that shape our favorite worlds. Have you ever wondered just how powerful a simple word can be? Not a shout, not a threat, but a quiet, barely audible whisper, repeated over and over in the dead of night. In the world of Westeros, where swords cleaved flesh and dragons burned cities, words held no less power. And for one small but unbreakable girl, these words became her prayer, her meditation, her guiding star in a labyrinth of vengeance. Imagine it. deep night. A cold wind howls outside the tent, or ruin where two lone travelers have found temporary refuge. The fire has almost died down, leaving behind only dull, pulsating embers, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. The air is thick with the smell of smoke, earth, and a faint hint of dampness. The hound, huge, unkempt, and accustomed to discomfort, lies curled by the fire, pretending to be fast asleep. His rough breathing is steady, but his eyes, hidden behind half-closed lids, occasionally twitch. He hears everything. Arya Stark sits opposite him, her small figure hunched, knees hugged to her chest. Her face, smudged with dirt and road dust, is barely visible in the gloom, but her eyes burn, reflecting the last sparks of the fire. Her voice is something remarkable. It contains no fury, no anger, at least not outwardly. It's a monotonous, almost lullaby whisper, as if she's reciting a list before bed to soothe her restless soul. A list that keeps her in this world, gives her purpose, a reason to exist in a world that has taken everything from her. It is her nightly litany, her vow, etched not on stone, but in her very soul. The first name that escapes her lips always evokes a special response. Joffrey Baratheon, spoken with a barely perceptible contempt, as thin as the blade of needle. Joffrey, the boy king, whose cruelty was as great as his cowardice. It was he who ordered the execution of her father, Lord Eddard Stark, on the steps of the great sept of Baelor. It was he who reveled in her sister Sansa's suffering, forcing her to watch their father's severed head. Joffrey, whose name was synonymous with betrayal and twisted power. Though Joffrey was already dead, poisoned at his own wedding, his name remained on Arya's list for a long time. It wasn't just revenge. It was a constant reminder of what had been lost and what she was fighting for. He was the first to steal her innocence, the first to show her the true ugliness of the world. And even when he was gone, his ghost remained, like an anchor for her rage. The next name, Cersei Lannister. This name sounds heavier, as if Arya pronounces it with deep, ingrained hatred. Cersei, the Queen Regent, whose ambition, lies, and intrigues led to her family's downfall. It was she, in Arya's opinion, who was behind all the misfortunes that befell them. Her cold calculation, her lust for power, her absolute lack of compassion, all made her the perfect target. Cersei was the embodiment of everything Arya hated about King's Landing. Luxury, hypocrisy, and mercilessness hidden behind noble titles. She was a spider, weaving her deadly web around anyone who dared stand in her way. Arya imagined herself entering the Red Keep, past the Golden Lions, and finally coming face to face with the one who destroyed her world, Island Payne. This man was no more than a tool, an executioner, but it was he who delivered the final blow, severing her father's head. In his silent, chilling presence, the entire heartlessness of royal power was embodied. He was the face Arya saw in nightmares, waking in a cold sweat, reliving that horrific scene again and again. He wasn't evil in the usual sense. He simply did his job. But for Arya, he was the symbol of that loss, that final farewell she never got to say. His hands were stained with her father's blood, and that was enough for his name to be forever etched on her list. Meryn Trant. This name sounds with particular disgust. A knight of the King's Guard, fat, cruel, and cowardly. He raised a hand against her when she was just a child. He beat Sansa at Joffrey's command. He was the embodiment of power abuse, a man who used his strength to bully and inflict pain for no other reason than his own twisted pleasure. For Arya, he was a base, filthy creature who deserved the most agonizing death. His cowardice and treachery only strengthened her resolve. She remembered him hitting her, mocking her as she tried to escape. That offense was deep and personal. Polliver, one of the first names added after her escape from King's Landing. A minor Lannister soldier who killed her friend Lamy Greenhands, taking his sword, and took Needle from Arya herself. This name symbolized for Arya the loss of the little she had and the helpless rage she felt, being unable to protect those she cared for. Polliver was the first to cross her path of vengeance, becoming a symbol of all those nameless soldiers who committed evil at their master's command. His murder was Arya's first step on the path to becoming. It was her first execution, and it was executed cold-bloodedly, almost methodically. He died the same way he killed Lamy, with Needle piercing his throat, the tickler. His name didn't evoke hatred, but rather a cold, calculated disgust. A man specializing in torture, in tickling people to death, extracting confessions, or simply reveling in their torment. Arya herself saw his work in Harrenhal, heard the screams of victims, felt the horror emanating from his presence. He was the embodiment of senseless cruelty, a man who had turned pain into art and suffering into his profession. His name evoked a shiver, but also a determination to put an end to such depravity. Walder Frey. With this name, Arya's tone changes, becoming harsh, almost tangible with bitterness. Walder Frey, Lord of the Crossing, the traitor who orchestrated the Red Wedding. This massacre claimed the lives of her mother, Lady Catelyn Stark, and her brother, Robb Stark, the king in the north. This was not merely betrayal. It was a violation of all laws of hospitality and honor, an act of unimaginable cruelty that shattered her family. Walder Frey became a symbol of all the nastiness, all the lies, and all the broken vows that led to the fall of her house. And his name remained on the list until Arya herself put an end to him, bringing vengeance for her kin. This was one of the most significant names. Crossing it off was an act of deep satisfaction. Ramsay Bolton. His name sounds almost like a curse. Ramsay, the Bolton bastard, later legitimized as Lord, whose sadistic nature was legendary. He tortured Theon Greyjoy. He held her sister Sansa captive, inflicting unbearable suffering upon her. Although Arya never faced him personally, rumors of his atrocities reached her ears, and that was enough for his name to make it onto her deadly list. He was the embodiment of pure, unadulterated evil, a man who found joy in others' pain. His survival meant continued suffering, and so he had to go. Then come the names that, over time, would be crossed off or reinterpreted. Melisandre, the Red Priestess, who took Gendry, her friend, from the Brotherhood without banners, to use his blood in her magical rituals. At that moment, for Arya, it was a betrayal, the kidnapping of someone she valued. She didn't understand the full complexity of her faith and purpose. She only saw her companion being taken. Later, when Arya would meet Melisandre again, before the Battle of Winterfell, Melisandre would remind her of the prophecy about death, and Arya would understand that their paths crossed for a higher purpose. Melisandre was struck from the list when Arya realized she served a different, more global purpose than simple revenge. Beric Dondarrion and Thoros of Myr, the leaders of the Brotherhood without banners, who gave Gendry to Melisandre. Their names were on the list for the same reason as Melisandre's. They were not her enemies in the true sense, but at that moment, Arya saw them only as those who deprived her of a friend. However, Later, during their travels, as Arya got to know them better, as she saw their selflessness and fight for justice, their names disappeared from her list. They were struck off not because of death, but because of understanding. Arya realized that their actions were motivated by faith, not evil, and that they were allies in a greater war. The Mountain, or Gregor Clegane, a name pronounced with particular heaviness, almost with a sense of physical pain. The Mountain, the Hound's brother, a monstrous knight whose cruelty was legendary. He was the executioner in Harrenhal, where Arya saw his atrocities with her own eyes. He tortured and killed innocent people, and his very presence was a source of terror. For Arya, he was the embodiment of inhumanity, a killing machine devoid of any morality. And of course, he was her companion, the Hound's enemy, the man who disfigured his face as a child. The Mountain was a symbol of absolute evil that she had to eradicate. Littlefinger, or Peter Baelish. His name sounds with cold, venomous clarity. Littlefinger, the master of intrigue, a traitor, a man whose cunning was deadlier than any sword. He betrayed her father, Lord Eddard, when he so desperately needed support. He manipulated events, igniting wars and pitting people against each other for his own gain. Arya learned of his betrayal much later, in Winterfell, from her sister Sansa and brother Bran. But when she understood the full depth of his lies and his role in the fall of their house, his name immediately joined the list. He was not a soldier, but a spider, weaving webs of lies, and his death was an act of purification. As Arya whispers these names, the Hound lies motionless. His rough, raspy snoring continues, but his ears twitch slightly. He has heard this list hundreds of times. He has seen Arya change. From the frightened girl he kidnapped, she transformed into a cold-blooded killing machine, driven by this single purpose. He himself was part of this world, full of violence and revenge, and therefore understood her motives. He didn't approve of them, didn't condemn them. He simply accepted it as part of her essence. He knew that this list was not just a collection of names. It was her anchor in the world's madness, her way of preserving her sanity, her guiding star. For him, it was more like a grim lullaby that lulled him to sleep, strangely comforting in its unchanging predictability. He himself lived surrounded by violence, and this daily litany was part of their shared, twisted routine. He understood that the words Arya spoke were sharper than any sword, because they shaped her, tempered her will, turned her into what she was meant to become. He saw in her an echo of his own brutality, but also something much purer, a thirst for justice, albeit distorted by a thirst for vengeance. This ritual was not only about revenge, it was about survival. In a world where she had no home, no family, no future, this list gave her purpose. It reminded her who she was, where she came from, and why she continued to fight. It was a way not to forget those who were lost and those who caused her pain. Each whisper was an act of defiance, an assertion of her will in a world that tried to break her. She didn't want to be a victim. She wanted to be a hunter, and the list was her compass. With each new night, with each new name, Arya became more refined, more ruthless. She learned stealth, sword fighting, the art of killing. She went through a lot: captivity, hunger, training with the faceless men in Bravos. And each time she returned to this list, she felt her resolve only strengthen. The list was her only constant companion, her invisible friend, who never betrayed her, never left her alone. Gradually, one by one, Names began to disappear from the list. Joffrey died, though not by her hand. Polliver received his retribution. Meryn Trant was killed by Arya, which became one of her first significant acts of revenge. Walder Frey and his sons fell by her hand, marking the completion of an entire chapter of her personal vendetta. Littlefinger was executed by Stark judgment in Winterfell, and Arya played no small part in that. Each time a name was crossed off, it wasn't just an act of retribution. It was also a reminder of the price she had to pay, of how she changed to achieve her goal. But even as names disappeared, others remained. Cersei, the Mountain, and sometimes other, less significant figures who had caused her pain along the way. The list changed, but its essence remained constant. It was a promise made to herself, to live to avenge. It was her internal map, her path in life. The fire burns out completely. The last red embers flicker, then die, leaving only cold ash. Complete silence falls. Only the hound's gentle snore disturbs it. Arya straightens. Her face is now completely hidden in the darkness, but in her eyes, if they could be seen, the same cold, determined fire would burn. Her ritual is complete until the next night. The words have been spoken. The promise has been reaffirmed. And though swords in Westeros rang louder and dragons burned brighter, the true power of that night lay in a whisper. In the whisper of a little girl whose words were sharper than any sword, foreshadowing the fates of those who dared harm the House of Stark. And this whisper, it seemed, was the only constant in her chaotic, violence-filled world, her only grim lullaby. If you found this deep dive into Arya's journey compelling, hit that like button, subscribe for more breakdowns of your favorite characters, and let me know in the comments, which character's story resonates most with you? What if silence wasn't just the absence of sound, but something ancient, heavy, and alive? The God's Wood of Winterfell wasn't merely quiet. It was a silence filled with centuries, thick and weighty, like the first snow settling on untouched ground. It blanketed the branches of the weirwoods and pines, covered the moss-grown stones, and hung still above the dark, steaming surface of the hot springs. For Sansa Stark, Queen in the North, this silence was the only cloak beneath which she could truly breathe. Here, in the heart of her home, she was neither queen, nor wolf, nor little bird. She was simply an extension of this ancient quiet, part of an unfinished song sung by the old gods. Every time she passed beneath the stone archway leading into the grove, the world behind her, full of clanging steel, whispering lords, and scratching parchment, receded. Yet, the peace was never complete. An unspoken sense of interrupted journey hung in the very air, as if someone, centuries ago, had embarked on a long voyage directly from this very grove and had never returned. Their tracks had long been buried by snow and autumn leaves, but the expectation itself had seeped into the bark of the trees and the silence of the stones. It wasn't an unsettling feeling, but rather a deep, thoughtful melancholy, the breath of something long forgotten, yet never truly gone. That evening, the cold bit particularly hard, and steam from the springs rose in thick, milky plumes, mingling with her own breath. Sansa sat on a flat stone, warmed from within, right at the water's edge. On her lap lay her cloak of heavy gray wool, trimmed with white direwolf fur. The cloak was still damp from the day's blizzard, and she slowly, almost mechanically, smoothed its folds, letting the warmth of the stone and the steam dry the fabric. Her fingers, long and pale, moved with measured grace. It was a simple, mundane action, yet it held an entire history. She wasn't just smoothing wool, she was unraveling the knots of the past. Each movement was like those she had made countless times in King's Landing, mending her dresses, or in the Eyrie, sorting through linen supplies. These were hands accustomed to patient, painstaking work, to creating order from chaos, be it tangled threads or a broken kingdom. She lowered her gaze to her palms. The skin was smooth, but beneath it, she felt a strength that the hands of the girl who once dreamed of nights and songs had lacked. She was untying invisible knots left on her soul by other hands, drying a cloak soaked not only by snow, but by the salty spray of the narrow sea, by tears shed far from home. This was her quiet preparation, not for battle or council, but for the night, for a meeting with herself. The movement of her fingers, working through the coarse wool, suddenly stilled. From the depths of memory, cold and clear as winter air, an image rose. It wasn't a memory of screams and steel, of pain or humiliation. It was a quiet moment, almost insignificant, yet all the more chilling for it. The Eyrie. She stands on the balcony, looking out at the Vale of Arran spread below, like a patchwork quilt. The air is thin and crisp, and behind her stands Peter Baelish. She doesn't see him, but she feels his presence, like a small creature sensing the shadow of a hawk above. He says nothing for several long moments, and then his quiet, insidious voice, like silk steeped in poison, murmurs that her hair is exactly like her mother's, only brighter, like autumn fire, and his fingers, dry and cool, touch a strand of her hair. This touch wasn't rough or cruel. It was possessive. In that moment, Sansa felt not fear, but a piercing, humiliating loneliness. She wasn't a person, but an object, a beautiful thing being compared to another, similar thing. She was a pawn on his board, and all the exhilaration from the dizzying height and beauty of the Vale instantly evaporated, leaving behind only emptiness and cold. The emotion of that moment was paramount. Not the intrigues, not the conspiracies, but absolute helplessness under an alien, appraising gaze. Sansa sharply exhaled, and a puff of steam mingled with the plumes from the springs. She was back in the present, in her godswood, but the shadow of the past breathed down her neck. Involuntarily, she ran a hand through her hair, as if wiping away the phantom touch of Littlefinger's fingers. A shiver ran down the skin of her neck, having nothing to do with the freezing northern air. It was that very cold she had learned to recognize, that shadow that lived beside her even here, in the safest place in the world. This was the consequence of her long journey, an intuition sharpened to a razor's edge, a habit of always sensing the space behind her. She knew there was no one in the grove but herself and the silent gods, but her body remembered differently. It remembered whispers in corridors, quiet footsteps outside doors, gazes that weighed more than stones. This wariness had become her second skin, a scar that didn't ache but always reminded her of itself. Sometimes, in the utter silence of her bedchamber, she would wake to a sound that wasn't there, a creaking floorboard, the rustle of fabric. And now, in the ringing silence of the godswood, every crack of a frozen branch, every sigh of wind in the pine needles seemed meaningful to her, carrying a hidden message she had to decipher to survive. It was at this exact moment, when her senses were stretched taut like a harp string, that something happened. The wind died completely. The thick steam from the springs froze in the air, standing in motionless columns. Even her own breathing seemed to hold still. And in this absolute ringing silence, a single leaf detached itself from the topmost branch of the weirwood. It didn't just fall. It descended slowly, spinning in a perfect, smooth spiral, scarlet, like a drop of fresh blood against the gray twilight and white snow. Sansa, holding her breath, watched its flight. The leaf flew, as if guided by an invisible hand, landing precisely in the center of the water's dark mirror, directly before her. It touched the surface without a ripple, and from it, slow, perfectly even circles spread across the water, like waves from a word cast into the soul. Sansa froze, gazing at this crimson sign on the black water. It wasn't a threat, nor a battle omen. It was something else, a hidden event, a quiet question posed to her by the universe itself. She didn't know what it meant, and didn't try to guess. She simply watched as the circle slowly spread, disturbing the water's perfect calm, as this small, blood-red leaf lay on its surface, like a seal on a secret letter. Her reaction was quiet, internal. Her heart didn't beat faster, but her entire being focused on this tiny event, which seemed more important than all royal decrees and scout reports. She sat, watching the leaf, and waves of thought spread through her mind as slowly as the ripples on the water. What was this? A sign from the old gods? A mere coincidence? A trick of wind and gravity? Or something more? She recalled all the paths that lay before her. The path of vengeance, which she had traversed, but whose echoes still resonated in her heart. The path of power, which she now walked, slippery and demanding constant vigilance. And there was another path, the path of oblivion, the temptation to remain here, in this silence, to let the world carry on somewhere beyond Winterfell's walls. This crimson leaf on the dark water was like a call to something new, unknown. Perhaps it was a hint of new danger, requiring her intervention, or perhaps a promise of something she had long lost. Two desires wrestled within her soul. One, to remain here, in this hard-won peace, in the warmth of the hot springs, protected by the ancient trees. This was the wish of a weary warrior who had found her home. But another desire, deeper and more ancient, tugged her after this leaf, after its mystery. It was the call of Stark blood, the call of the path, the call of the North, which is never truly at peace. She weighed risk against repose, the urge to move against the value of stillness, to go further, to immerse herself once more in a world of intrigue and battles, or to preserve what she had. Her decision came as quietly as the leaf fell. She didn't move from her spot. She didn't reach out to retrieve it from the water, nor did she try to unravel its mystery. She simply accepted it as part of this night, as part of this godswood. The choice was made. For now, she would stay. She chose the peace of this evening, the warmth of the stone beneath her, the silence filled with the whispers of ages. Sansa slowly lifted her almost dry cloak from her lap and wrapped herself more tightly in it, burying her face in the soft, winter-scented direwolf fur. This gesture wasn't just protection from the cold. It was an embrace in which she held herself. It was a farewell, not to the grove, but to the impulse that had stirred her soul for a moment. She decided not to go, not tonight. She listened to herself, to her weariness, to her right, to this brief moment of solitude, and did not rush events. The ripples on the water had almost vanished, and only the crimson leaf continued to lie on the surface, small and bright. Sansa extinguished the wick of her small lantern, and the godswood sank into its natural spectral light, where shadows were deeper and the silence thicker. The water in the spring became smooth again, like black glass. The leaf lay motionless on its surface, like a frozen tear from the weirwood. The silence returned, but it was no longer the same. Now, within it lived the knowledge of the wonder that had just transpired, of the question asked and left unanswered. Sansa sat in the darkness, wrapped in her cloak, her silhouette almost merging with the ancient stones. She no longer looked at the water. She looked deep within herself, to where the echoes of her long and terrible journey lay stilled. The Godswood's whisper was quiet for this night. It had given her what she came for, not answers, but the strength to ask questions and the wisdom not to rush for a reply. Perhaps next time a leaf falls from the branch, the wind will bring something more than just cold. Perhaps next time she will decide to follow it, but that will be next time. For now, the North held the peace of its queen, and the trees waited patiently. If you found Sansa's quiet moment as captivating as we did, give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the world of Westeros. Have you ever felt a silence so profound it wasn't empty, but full of unspoken things? That was Winterfell. Not the dead hush of deep snow blanketing the land, but a silence thick with anticipation, like pre-dawn mist. Every rustle, every creak of a floorboard echoed not just in the stone corridors, but deep within the soul itself. The ancient walls of the castle seemed to hold their breath alongside their lord. The war was over, banners furled, swords returned to scabbards, yet peace had not found its way to these northern lands. It merely shimmered on the horizon like a distant mirage. Here, in the heart of House Stark, hung a sense of an unfinished journey, as if the final, most crucial step had yet to be taken. The air was heavy with premonition, vague and unsettling, like the memory of a forgotten dream. This was not the breath of the past, but of the future, standing on the threshold, unheard yet palpable, ready to burst in and forever alter the familiar way of life. Something grand, yet terrifyingly fragile, was destined to emerge from this tense quiet. Something that could either heal old wounds or inflict new, even deeper ones. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, sat in his solar, gazing into the flames dancing in the massive hearth. His face, usually stern and unyielding like the northern cliffs, was now shadowed by deep fatigue and poorly concealed anxiety. He had just returned, but he didn't feel at home. His body was here, in the warmth and safety of his ancestral seat, but his soul still wandered the scorched fields of the Trident, mourning at the foot of a tower that smelled of blood and winter roses. Mechanically, with a familiar movement, he unbuckled his belt. The heavy bull leather slipped from his hips, and he placed it with a dull thud on the oak table. Ice, his Valyrian steel sword, remained in the armory, yet the phantom weight of the weapon still lingered, ingrained in his muscles from long months of war. This simple gesture, removing his belt, was a ritual, an attempt to separate his past self, the warrior and avenger, from his present self, the husband and lord awaiting the birth of his firstborn. Ned's fingers, calloused from sword hilt and reins, slowly traced the carved direwolf patterns on the table's surface. He looked up at the old map of Westeros hanging on the wall. His eyes followed the long, bloody path south, and then back north. Every town, every river on that map resonated in his memory with pain, loss, and oaths that now lay heavy on his conscience. He tried to focus on the present, on the sounds of the castle, but they were muffled, as if coming from beneath deep water. The only thing that pierced this veil was the distant, barely discernible sounds from his wife Catelyn's chambers. They were quiet, but to Ned, they sounded louder than any war horn. He was drying his cloak by the fire, not because it was wet from the rain, but because he needed something to occupy his hands, to perform a simple, understandable action in a world that had suddenly become complex and unpredictable. The flames in the hearth flickered, and an orange glow fell upon Ned's face, highlighting the sorrowful crease by his lips from the gloom. Suddenly, the walls of the solar dissolved, and he was there again. In Dorne, at the base of the tower, Prince Rhaegar had named the Tower of Joy. What a cruel, mocking name for a place where his heart had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. He didn't think of the duel, of the gleam of steel, and the death rattles of the Seven Kingdoms' finest knights. His memory stubbornly pulled him inside, into a room permeated with the scent of death and fading blue roses. He saw his sister, Lyanna, beautiful and wild like a northern flower, fading on a blood-stained bed. He remembered the feverish heat of her hand, the frantic glint in her gray, stark eyes, and the quiet whisper meant for him alone. "Promise me, Ned." Those words still haunted his dreams, echoing in the wail of the winter wind. He remembered not only her words, but the feeling that overwhelmed him when she placed a tiny warm bundle in his hands. He remembered looking into the dark, serious eyes of the infant for the first time and feeling the full weight of the promise he had made. This was not the joy of discovery, not the elation of fatherhood. It was pure, unadulterated grief and the burden of a duty he would have to carry alone for the rest of his days. That was his first experience of fatherhood, secret, bitter, tinged with the death of a loved one. And now, sitting by the hearth in his own castle, awaiting the birth of his legitimate heir from a woman he barely knew, Ned felt like an imposter. The emotion of that moment, not the adventure itself, was etched into his soul. An overwhelming loneliness in the face of a secret he could share with no one, not even Robert, to whom he was closer than a blood brother. A sharp, muffled cry from the corridor ripped Eddard from the abyss of his memories. He flinched, and the illusion of the Dornish tower crumbled to dust, leaving behind only the bitter aftertaste of ashes and roses. He was back in Winterfell, in his solar, cold sweat beating on his brow. The scar on his soul, left by Lyanna's death and her last request, throbbed with renewed intensity. It was the shadow of his past, following him relentlessly, breathing down his neck even here, within the seemingly safe walls of his home. This shadow was not a threat, but a constant reminder of his double life, of the lie upon which the future of his house would now have to be built. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held newborn Jon, now clenched into fists, powerless. He couldn't be there, beside Catelyn, couldn't share her pain, just as he couldn't share his own with her. Such were the traditions. Men had no place in the birthing room. But for Ned, this rule was more than just adherence to custom. It was a symbol of the chasm that lay between him and his wife. He felt guilty towards her. Catelyn Tully, proud daughter of Riverrun, married to him out of duty to seal an alliance against the Targaryens, deserved more. She deserved a husband whose heart belonged to her entirely, not one fractured between duty, grief, and a secret. Every muffled sound from her chambers was a reproach to him. He always woke up at night when he dreamed of Lyanna, and now he understood that he would similarly flinch at every cry of his child, because that cry would always remind him of another infant, hidden in the south, of his secret nephew, whom the world had to believe was his bastard. The fatigue accumulated during the war was nothing compared to this internal, spiritual exhaustion. Time dragged on agonizingly slowly. Each minute felt like an eternity. Ned paced the solar, restless. He walked to the window and peered into the gray dawn, barely breaking over the crenellated walls. He sat down by the hearth again, trying to steady his trembling hands. And then all sounds ceased. The tense silence that had hung over the castle was replaced by another, a deafening, absolute emptiness. Ned's heart seemed to stop. He froze in the middle of the room, listening, afraid to breathe. And in that ringing silence, he heard it. A new sound, unlike anything before. A thin, plaintive, almost cat-like squeak. It was not a cry of pain, nor a groan of suffering. It was the cry of life. His son's first cry. Ned stood still, as if struck by lightning. The entire world narrowed to this single sound. It was not loud or demanding, but it pierced through the thick stone walls, broke through the veil of his anxieties, and struck directly at his heart. In this weak cry was incredible power, asserting its right to exist. Ned did not rush to the door. He stood motionless, like a statue, and just listened. He absorbed this sound, allowing it to fill the void in his soul. It was not just a baby's cry. It was the voice of the future, the voice of House Stark, which had not fallen silent, had not ceased, which continued despite all wars, deaths, and losses. In that moment, Ned felt neither joy nor relief in their usual sense. He felt something far deeper and more sacred, a tremor before the miracle of new life, before the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. The silhouette of the old wet nurse, flitting through the doorway at the far end of the corridor and immediately vanishing, was the only confirmation that this was not a dream. This was the beginning of something he could not yet fully comprehend, but which had irrevocably changed everything. The solar door creaked softly. Meister Lewin stood on the threshold, his face, as always, calm, etched with lines of fatigue, but with a warm spark in his eyes. He announced that Lord Eddard had a son, and that Lady Catelyn, though exhausted, was out of danger. The Meister's words were simple and mundane, but to Ned, they sounded like a verdict and a pardon all at once. Now, he had to step across the threshold, not just the threshold of his solar, but the threshold of his former life. He walked slowly down the corridor, each step echoing in the empty space and in his soul. He weighed his past and his future on invisible scales. On one side was loyalty to Lyanna's memory, the weight of the promise he had made her, the image of the dark-haired boy he had left far to the south. This was the path of duty, honor, and grief, a path he knew and understood. On the other side was her, Catelyn, a woman with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes as blue as the waters of the Trident, a woman who became his wife by the will of their fathers, not by the call of his heart. And now, between them stood their son, the living embodiment of their union, their shared future. He felt drawn to the peace this new world promised, the peace of a family hearth, children's laughter, the warmth of his wife's hand in his own. But he also recognized the risk. Could he build true happiness on a foundation that had been laid with a lie from the very beginning? Could he look into the eyes of Catelyn and his son, knowing that part of his heart and his thoughts would always belong to another woman and another child? This was a struggle between the desire to remain in his familiar and understandable grief and the call to move forward into the unknown, frightening yet alluring country called family. He stopped before the door to her chambers. His hand hovered an inch from the carved handle. Beyond that door was his son, and his wife, and his new life. He took a deep breath, pushing away doubt, and resolutely pushed the door open. The room was filled with twilight, the air thick with the scent of herbs, sweat, and something else, primal and sweet, the smell of birth. Maidservants bustled by the fire, but Ned barely noticed them. His gaze was fixed on the large canopied bed. Catelyn lay on the pillows, her face pale and drawn, her fiery hair darkened with sweat and spread across the white pillowcase. She looked incredibly fragile, but in her blue eyes, fixed on him, burned a fire, fierce, like a dire wolf protecting its young. Their eyes met, and in that second, words became unnecessary. In her eyes, he read not only physical pain and exhaustion, but also a question, a challenge, and a hint of triumph. She had fulfilled her duty. She had given House Stark an heir. She had done what neither war nor politics could do. She had woven her southern blood into the ancient lineage of the first men. Ned slowly approached the bed. Catelyn gave a subtle nod, and one of the maidservants, moving silently, approached her with a small bundle in her arms. Catelyn received it with such tenderness and care, as if holding the world's greatest treasure. She pushed herself up slightly on her elbows and extended the bundle to Ned. He paused for a moment, then reached out and took his burden, his son. He was so tiny, so unbelievably light after the weight of a Valyrian sword. His face was red and wrinkled, eyes tightly shut, and on his head, a fuzz of reddish hair, a Tully inheritance. In that moment, Ned made his choice. He did not leave, did not turn away. He stayed. He accepted this child, and with him, his mother, and their shared future. He wrapped the infant more tightly in the blanket, as if protecting him not only from the room's coolness, but from all the shadows of his past and all the dangers of the future. This gesture was a farewell to the Ned he had been before, and a vow of allegiance to the man he was to become. He extinguished the fire of war and grief in his soul to let a new, quiet flame ignite. Eddard Stark sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the tiny face sleeping in his arms. Catelyn, exhausted, rested her head on the pillows, but her gaze, too, was fixed on their son. Silence fell in the room, but now it was not the anxious silence of waiting, nor the empty silence after a storm. It was a silence of understanding, thick and rich, like old wine. In this quiet, Ned and Catelyn truly met for the first time. Not as Lord of Winterfell and Lady Stark, not as representatives of two great houses sealing an alliance, but as a man and a woman, father and mother, united by the miracle they had created together. The quiet cry that had pierced the castle walls hours ago forever changed their marriage. It broke down the wall of estrangement and duty that stood between them, and in its place, a fragile sprout of something new began to grow. Respect, tenderness, shared responsibility. Ned looked at Catelyn, and in her answering gaze, he saw for the first time not the pride of a river-run daughter, but the vulnerability and trust of a woman. He understood that their journey was only just beginning. It would be difficult, full of unspoken words and old ghosts. Jon's secret still lay like a stone in his heart. But now he was not alone. Beside him was she and their son, whom they would name Robb, after his best friend and king. A son who would one day become Lord of Winterfell and carry the Stark name forward into the future. The first ray of the rising sun broke through the high, arched window and fell upon the three of them, outlining their silhouettes in golden light. A new life had begun, but somewhere beyond the castle walls, shadows were gathering, and the long winter was still as close as ever. Could this quiet newborn love withstand the coming storms? Perhaps next time, things will be different. Perhaps. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Eddard Stark's untold moments, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories from Westeros, and let me know in the comments, what other characters' inner thoughts would you like us to explore?